Immanuel Kant, a well-known 18th century philosopher, once wrote, "Live your life as though every act were to become a universal law." In this short statement is a reflection of Kant's philosophy of ethics, which is commonly known today as deontology. In this short video, we will define deontology, contrast it briefly with competing theories of moral philosophy, look at historical examples which influenced Immanuel Kant's own views, and explore the underlying philosophical claims which lay the foundation for deontology. Deontology declares that humans are obliged to follow universal moral laws. That is to say, there are universal laws that all humans ought to follow at all times. These laws transcend both culture and time, meaning that they are binding upon all people regardless of when or where they live. Deontology is also sometimes referred to as duty-based ethics, as it believes that humans have a responsibility to fulfill their moral duties. Deontology, therefore, finds the morality of an action within the action itself. It does not factor in the consequence of an action, the motivations behind an action, the circumstances surrounding the action, or the means of the action being completed. Because of this, deontology is sometimes seen as rigid, narrow-minded, and insensitive. Contrasting deontology to other views on morality can help us to better understand what it is. For example, deontology is different from consequentialism in that consequentialism locates the morality of an action in its consequence. The goodness or badness of an action is based upon the action's result. Deontology can also be contrasted to virtue ethics, which emphasizes the character of the person who engages in an action. In this sense, virtue ethics locates morality primarily in the motivation, the outflow of a person's character. Deontology, however, is not concerned with the character of the person but is fully fixed upon the action itself. Deontology can also be contrasted to subjective moralism, which states that morals vary from person to person and from culture to culture. There's no single moral standard to conform to because all morals are made up by humans and are therefore flexible and arbitrary. Deontology, on the other hand, states that morals exist outside of the human mind, are objective, and do not vary from person to person. Aristotle, an early philosopher who lived during the 4th century BC, was influential in the development of deontology. Aristotle believed in objective morality, which he called natural law. This natural law to Aristotle is eternal and unchanging, common to all, regardless of the source. While Aristotle believed that natural law ought to be followed so that a person may become more virtuous, this philosophical understanding of objective morality would impact philosophers throughout history. Aristotle also wrote about what he called legal law, which were statutes enforced within a society that did not come from natural law. Unless the legal law conflicted with the natural law, Aristotle believed that members of each society were obliged to follow it. Moving on through history, we come to Thomas Aquinas, the famous Catholic philosopher who lived during the 13th century AD. Having drawn upon the writings of Aristotle, whom he simply referred to as the philosopher, Aquinas looked to support the Bible's teachings of objective morality with philosophical argument. For Aquinas, there are two methods of arriving at truth. One is revelation, where God reveals truth to humans through the Bible. The other is reason, the God-given gift to observe and discern truth by using our minds. Some truth can only be known through revelation, and some truth only through reason, yet they would never contradict one another. When it came to morals, Aquinas denied that they were simply values that could be different between people. He also denied that actions should be evaluated morally by the results they produce. Instead, to Aquinas, actions can be evaluated objectively by measuring how much they conform to the character of God. To understand this concept better, think about a triangle. By definition, a triangle is a two-dimensional shape with three straight sides whose interior angles add up to 180 degrees. Yet we draw triangles that aren't perfectly triangular all the time. In fact, every triangle ever drawn deviates from the perfect concept of triangularity, even if only by a tiny and unnoticeable degree. We can objectively measure the goodness or badness of a triangle based on how close it conforms to the definition of a triangle, or what Aquinas would call the essence of triangularity. In this sense, one triangle may be good if it closely resembles the essence of triangularity, while another may be bad if it poorly resembles the essence of triangularity. We may say the same about anything. A cat with 3 legs, for example, is still a cat, but it is a relatively bad cat in that it doesn't accurately resemble the essence of catness, which would entail an animal that has 4 legs. To Aquinas, morality is simply taking the system of evaluation and applying it to actions. The standard for triangles is triangularity. The standard for cats is catness. The standard for actions is the character of God. At their core, good and bad are terms that describe how closely a thing resembles its standard. To Aquinas, there is no reason to evaluate morality any differently than how we evaluate how well someone draws a triangle. Just as we can compare a triangle to triangularity and come out with an objective evaluation, so too the same can be done with actions. While Aquinas' view of morality is different than deontology in that it factors in motivation and consequence along with the action itself, its highly developed view of objective morality and its emphasis on the responsibility of people to conform their actions to their standard would continue to influence ethical philosophy. Deontology is typically associated most closely with the ethical philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Influenced by Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, Kant postulated that there is objective morality and that humans have a responsibility to conform to it. Kant's belief that morality is found solely within the action brought with it criticism. For example, say that a murderer approached a man and demanded him to tell him where his family was so he could go kill them. According to strict deontology, which states that lying is always wrong, the man would be obliged to be honest, telling the murderer where his family was. The possible result of the action should not be taken into account when factoring in the morality of giving the information. However, if the family is then killed, would that make the man at least partially responsible? This question has been debated among philosophers discussing deontology since its inception. Another contribution Kant made to ethical philosophy was his moral argument for the existence of God. Kant wrote that, in order for morals to have any true meaning, justice must take place. He realized that, since the wicked often prosper, while the good often suffer on earth, justice must take place after death. Yet for this justice to be perfectly just, the judge himself would have to be perfectly righteous and just. But beyond this, the judge would need to know all things in order to judge perfectly, and he would have to be powerful enough to enact perfect justice. Therefore, if morals are to have any true meaning, a perfectly righteous, all-knowing, all-powerful judge would have to exist. For us as Christians, we refer to him as God. A more flexible form of deontology was developed by W.D. Ross in the mid-20th century. Ross developed the concept of prima facie duty. Under his view of ethics, humans have moral duties which they ought to fulfill. However, circumstances may dictate which moral obligations ought to be actually carried out. Depending on the circumstance, one moral obligation may be more compelling to follow and therefore override the norm. So in this sense, not only does one take into account the action itself, but also the circumstances surrounding it. Let's look at an example. Let's say you are walking along a private road in the woods when you come upon an elderly man who is suffering from a heart attack. You realize that he needs immediate medical assistance, and you left your cell phone in your car about 2 miles away. You happen to see an unattended bicycle laying in the grass nearby. Take a second to think about what would be permissible under deontology, and then what would be permissible under W.D. Ross's prima facie interpretation. With deontology, you would need to fulfill your duty to help another person. Yet at the same time, since stealing is always wrong, it could be seen as morally objectionable to steal the bicycle, even if only so that you can quickly get to your phone to call medical responders. Under deontology, to best fulfill your moral obligations, you may need to run to your vehicle so that you fulfill your duty to help the man while also not stealing someone else's property. However, under Ross's flexible view, it would be permissible to take the bicycle to decrease the response time of medical assistance and so that you can return quickly to the man. The circumstances of the situation cause you to override your moral duty not to take someone else's property. This example demonstrates one strength which prima facie duty has over deontology proper. For us as Christians, deontology may not perfectly align with the Bible's view of morality. However, there are some similarities that can be good reminders for us. Immanuel Kant believed in objective morality. But what was that standard? In Romans 7:7, Paul writes that God's word shows us what the standard is, for we would not know sin if it were not for his law. Deontology also reminds us that it is one thing to know the law, but also with that, we have a responsibility to keep it. In James 1:22, we are called to be doers of the word and not hearers only. And Jesus says in John 14:15 that if we love him, we will keep his commands. As Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 6:20, we are not our own, as we have been bought with a price. Therefore, we ought to glorify God with our bodies. Deontology is useful in taking seriously the charge to live righteously and avoid living in immorality. In conclusion, deontology is an interesting theory on ethics that has both its strengths and its shortcomings. Many philosophers have incorporated elements of deontology into their works in their emphasis on moral objectivity and the responsibility to conform to it. When modified by a biblical worldview, it can be useful for Christians to use in sanctification, apologetics, and evangelism.